We'd like to begin our second panel discussion. And apologies that we weren't completely organized to entertain questions in Polish in the first panel, but we can do this now. We have headsets so please, when we come to the questions and discussion, if you wish to ask a question or make a comment in Polish, please do so. Let me set the stage before we come to our panelists with a few more words about the Free Europe Committee and the organization of Radio Free Europe itself. And we had a very useful discussion in the first panel about the larger context of U.S. government support for a variety of public and emigre-related organizations. The Free Europe Committee was, to my mind, a special public-private partnership amongst the U.S. government and the influential private citizens that were involved in setting it up. You know the names, you've heard some of them this morning. The architects were really George Kennan, Frank Wisner, and Alan Dulles before he entered the government. And Alan Dulles is a crucial figure here because if he had not been involved in setting up the Free Europe Committee as a New York lawyer, and had not then later entered CIA, first as deputy director and later after 1953 as director, the story of Free Europe Committee, I think, would have been different, and it would have had less autonomy. I stress the autonomy of the Free Europe Committee in my own thinking and my own writing. Yes, it was funded secretly out of the U.S. intelligence budget. And yes, the U.S. government, more the State Department than the National Security Council, more than the CIA, had the overall policy responsibility and policy guidance. But I stress the considerable autonomy, and we've had reference to the October 4th, 1949 agreement between the Free Europe Committee and the Office of Policy Coordination. I submit that that's a unique document, and you would not find a counterpart document with any other CIA-funded organization. That would be my argument. In CIA terms, the term of art within CIA was proprietary. For these funded organizations, they were called proprietaries. And there's a lot of discussion in the CIA, particularly in the 60s, about how the Free Europe Committee was not a proper proprietary because it was not properly controlled. And so it's by the end of the 60s then that Richard Helms is able to argue this organization really doesn't need us, As long as it's not part of the government bureaucracy, the CIA does not have to be involved. And I think I just make that point. The larger point, and I think it goes to any thinking about a successful influence operation that's funded by a government, perhaps any government, any place, and it goes to Scott Lucas's point about the networks and the locals. Initiative, if this is to be successful, the initiative has to come from below. And my argument about the Free Europe Committee would be that all the important strategic and tactical initiatives came from bottom up, not from top down, not from Washington, but from bottom up. That goes to the concept of a home service radio. Robert Lang and Bill Griffith developed that more than anything else. It goes to the concept of the printed word program, which Sam Walker and then later George Minden initiated. It goes to many of the other projects we've been talking about. So bottom up, tapping the initiative and experience of people from below. Radio broadcasts were not the first Free Europe project, as we've said and as we know, but they became the best known and arguably the most effective of the FEC projects. And the only one, that's important, the only one that continued, with one exception, the only one that continued after 1971, when the CIA and secret funding was no longer involved. and continued the radio broadcasts, Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty continued with open congressional funding. The other program that continued, which was not acknowledged for a long time, but now is acknowledged by the CIA, was the book program. Many details are not released, but the fact that CIA continued to support that outside the Free Europe or Radio Free Europe orbit is now acknowledged, and that, of course, is an area for much more research. Sometimes RFE is talked about as a radio station. It was not a radio station. It was a network of 5 and then later 8 national broadcasting network services. And to my mind, the key to the success, and much has been written about this, is the decentralization of Radio Free Europe. It's not that national or emigre or exile broadcasters had no context or control. There was some. We know some of the famous ones. American policy prohibited the Polish service from taking the position it would have liked to take on the western border, on the Oder-Neisse. That wasn't a CIA imposition. That was CIA passing on the restrictions opposed by the National Security Council, the White House, and the State Department. But all the initiative for day-to-day broadcasts were with the broadcast services. And that's why the Polish service could be so effective, and I think why many of the other services could be effective. So the point of my saying this is that if we're going to understand the history of Radio Free Europe, we have to look carefully at each national or country broadcasting service and not try to generalize or homogenize from the top. And that's what we're going to try to do today. I posed a number of questions to our panelists, and of course, to answer them would take us a couple of days. We can't do that, but at least let's have some of the questions in mind before I turn to the panelists, and who will say what they can in the limited time. Some of the questions I posed: how important were the initial Radio Free Europe broadcasts from New York? Who were the key broadcasters or other actors? Where did they come from? The original concept in 1948-49 was that national councils would designate the broadcasters. We know that never happened. It couldn't happen. So if that didn't happen, who were these people? How did they come to the positions of director of the broadcasting services and key broadcasters? What was the relationship of RFE Munich to RFE New York? How did broadcast policy evolve over time? What were the most important programs in the broadcast schedule? Because these were all service home radio broadcasts with everything from sports to music to religion. So what were the most important programs in that whole mix of things? What kind of audience feedback was there? How soon did the communist regimes take notice? What was the relationship to other FEC projects? And if we want to draw some judgments at the end of the Free Europe period in 1971, how effective? What's the balance sheet? How effective were the individual national broadcasts? Many questions. We can only explore a bit of that today, but let's cover what ground we have. You have the biographies of our panelists in printed form, so I won't repeat the text that's there. Just a few words about our panelists, and we'll go in this order. Anna Bischof is an associate of the Collegium Carolinum in Munich and completing her doctoral dissertation at Munich University on the Czechoslovak service of Radio Free Europe. Paweł Machcewicz, who needs no introduction here, is director of the Museum of the Second World War and professor of the Institute of Political Science, the Polish Academy of Science, and the author of the important book on Polish regime, Perceptions of and Countermeasures Against Radio Free Europe, a book which will be published in English also this fall by the Wilson Center Press. Ioana Macrea Toma is a research fellow at the Open Society Archives in Central European University, as is András Mink, our colleague from the Open Society Archives, and also a lecturer at Central European Union. So an excellent panel with all of whom have done considerable work on different parts of Radio Free Europe. We'll turn first to the Czechoslovak service and Anna Bischof.
Thank you very much, Ross. I would like to draw your attention to three aspects which, in my opinion, were characteristic for RFE's Czechoslovak desk and which at the same time reveal the most significant tensions that existed in this desk. Then I will also say a few words about the programming and relations with exile organizations. For many Czech and Slovak emigres, RFE did not only represent a unique tool for influence and a channel for communication and exchange with their fellow countrymen at home, but RFE was also one of the very few employers in the West who would allow them to work in their native language and in an intellectual environment for a decent salary. However, assembling the Czechoslovak desk in the early 1950s took some time, especially because at first it was not easy to find enough people who were able to write broadcasts on a certain intellectual level and also speak them in front of the microphone. This was especially true for the smaller Slovak exile community. Besides the Czech journalist Ferdinand Peroutka, based in New York, Paweł Tikrit, the program director in Munich, was responsible for assembling the desk. To do this, both men used their contacts in the exile community, but also the help of emigre organizations. Tikrit and his men also visited refugee camps in southern Germany to find staff among newly arrived emigres. The Czechoslovak desk eventually took shape and brought together people, the majority of whom had belonged to the cultural or political elite in Czechoslovakia before their emigration. Listening to their broadcasts, it becomes soon obvious how deep most of these emigres were rooted in the first Czechoslovak Republic and its mindset and ideas. Many of them had supported the president of the first Czechoslovak Republic, Tomáš Garrigue Masaryk, a topic that would be discussed over and over in the broadcasts. While some of the staff had been working with newspapers, journals, or publishers in Czechoslovakia, almost nobody had any experience with broadcasting. Of course, as always, there are a few exceptions. For example, Paweł Tikrit and also Jan Stransky had been working for the BBC during the war. But as a consequence, early broadcasts were often written in the style of newspaper articles. And Ferdinand Peroutka, a newspaperman himself, once said that, I quote, "If we cannot print our newspapers in Czechoslovakia, we will read them on air." So only gradually the broadcast operation became more and more professional, also thanks to professional training provided by the Voice of America. The Czech and Slovak journalists shared the fight against the communist regime in their homeland, but apart from that, however, this group of people cannot be described as homogeneous. So which were the dividing lines then? First, that was the political orientation. Although sharing the anti-communist attitude, they represented different political attitudes within the Democratic Party spectrum. Obviously, there were differences of opinion about the future of Czechoslovakia and also about the concrete design or focus of RFE programs. I would argue that the fragmentation of the Czechoslovak political exile at that time was also reflected in the Czechoslovak desk of RFE. However, it never went as far as, for example, at the Council of Free Czechoslovakia, where the functioning of the organization became endangered because of personal and political conflicts between the emigres. But also the team Peroutka and Tikrit did not last for long. They split in 1952 because of questions of authority, that is between New York and Munich, and because of their apparently different ideas about the concept and the programming of the Czechoslovak desk. The American RFE management supported Peroutka, and as a result, Tigrit left RFE. Second, it is important to note that in later years there were representatives of two major emigration waves employed at RFE's Czechoslovak desk. Those who left in 1948 and those who left by the end of the 60s after the crushing of the Prague Spring. Emigres who had left immediately after the communist takeover in February 1948 sometimes disapproved of their fellow countrymen who left the country after 1968. In many cases, the emigres of 1968 had at least passively supported the establishing and functioning of the communist regime, because of which the emigres of 1948 had to flee. In contrast to this first generation of RFE journalists, those who emigrated after '68 had experienced life under the communist regime themselves, which in fact had been seen as an advantage by the RFE management. Some of the 68 emigres had been employed in the media sector before their emigration, and quite a few of them were professional radio journalists already by the time they arrived in Munich. For example, Slava Wolny, Milan Schulz, and also Karel Jastinski. The employment of those young and highly skilled journalists also evoked tension among the members of the desk. Third, the Czechoslovak desk was RFE's only bilingual service. Consequently, both Czech and Slovak editors, speakers, and so on were needed. This resulted in a large number of staff. However, the desk had a majority of Czech employees facing far fewer Slovak colleagues. And this fact was also a cause for tension at any time during the existence of the Czechoslovak desk. Some Slovaks kept claiming a separate Slovak desk, but the American leadership always denied this request, arguing that this would not reflect the political situation, and consequently a Slovak desk at RFE was established only in 1993 when the independent Slovak Republic came into being. One important issue were the leading positions in the desk, which were usually occupied by Czechs. Eventually, RFE established the rule that if the director of the desk was a Czech, his deputy had to be a Slovak, and the other way around. So this other way around happened only once when the Slovak lawyer and politician Samuel Beloš was director from 1975 to 82. As RFE aimed at being a surrogate home service, as Ross already said, it offered a very broad range of programs. News, of course, but also economic, cultural, music, sports, religious, and educational broadcasts. There were programs for women, for children, farmers, teachers, communists, and so on. The Czechoslovak communist authorities reacted with jamming of RFE's frequencies, and in fact, the jamming of RFE's Czech and Slovak broadcasts lasted especially long, until the end of the year 1988. Although listening to RFE was officially not forbidden in Czechoslovakia, people usually listened to RFE in secret because otherwise they would have faced consequences such as, for instance, interrogations. RFE monitored the jamming of its frequencies and adjusted its program accordingly. For example, broadcasts which were considered especially important, and these were usually the political broadcasts, were transmitted at a time when jamming was less efficient. For example, Ferdinand Perotka's popular political commentary was aired on Sunday, as many people in Czechoslovakia spent weekends in the countryside, and the reception of RFE frequencies was usually better in the countryside than in bigger cities where jamming was stronger. Of course, RFE's broadcast policy did change over the years. In short, the general tone of RFE changed from the harsh anti-communist rhetoric of the early 50s to a more moderate one, roughly following the phases of the Cold War. Whereas RFE's first policy handbook, dating from 1951, states that RFE's mission was to remind the listeners that they are governed by agents of a foreign power and to display and emphasize the moral and spiritual emptiness of communism as an ideology. The 1972 policy guidelines see RFE's main aim in performing the function of a free press, providing a wide spectrum of facts, analysis, and opinions in order that listeners be able to form their views on the basis of maximum relevant information. To conclude, I would like to come back to the question of the role of emigre organizations. The Free Europe Committee's initial idea of a radio service created for or even by the emigres and their organizations was abandoned as early as 1950 because, among other reasons, it was clear that exile groups were divided and the animosity between and especially within them was very strong, as we have already heard in the first panel today. Also, many emigre organizations pursued more radical or more extensive goals which were not consistent with RFE's policy. So, for example, the emigre organizations usually wanted the liberation of their countries as soon as possible. Or another example, national Slovak exile organizations called for an independent Slovak state, whereas RFE supported a common Czechoslovak state. Still, the image of an emigre radio was kept, although in reality not implemented, and RFE was presented as the voice of the emigres, both to the audience and to the employees. And of course, there are many reasons for this. Among others, the image played an important role in terms of credibility with the listeners and in terms of the self-image of the emigre employees. RFE was thus anxious to keep emigre organizations and their quarreling out of the radio as much as possible. However, the various political and cultural organizations were an important pool for recruiting staff and for the generation of knowledge about the target societies of RFE's broadcasts. Last but not least, many members of the Czechoslovak desk were organized in these associations, and so keeping emigre organizations at a distance did not always work out. So, thank you.
Thank you very much. So I think we go right to Paweł, please.
Thank you very much. If we look at the initial years of Polish service of Radio Free Europe, it could be clearly divided into two stages. The first stage is when the Polish service operated from New York, and the second one when the Polish service was started its work from Munich. It was in May 1952. The Polish broadcasts of Radio Free Europe started in August 1950, and they were prepared by a relatively small team located in New York. It consisted of a dozen of full-time employees and a bunch of freelancers. Some of them were very eminent intellectuals and writers. The first head of the Polish section in New York was Lesław Bodeński, a pre-war employee of Polish Foreign Ministry, and then he was replaced in 1951 by Stanisław Strzetelski, a pre-war journalist. During that time, the programs were prepared in New York and tapes were flown to Germany, and they were broadcast from a relatively small transmitter located in the US occupation zone. I would say that the impact of Polish service of Radio Free Europe during that initial 2 years was relatively small. A confirmation of this intuition could be many documents by Polish communist authorities which mention Radio Free Europe on the same level with other Western broadcasters as Voice of America, BBC, Radio France, and Radio Madrid. The breakthrough came in May 1952 when the Polish service was created, was located in Munich. For more or less 3 years, there were two groups of editors, one still working in New York and another one working in Munich. And this Munich section was expanding, and in 1955, the New York staff was subordinated to the Munich headquarters. The head of the Munich section and subsequently of the whole Polish service of Radio Free Europe was Jan Nowak-Jeziorański, Zdzisław Jeziorański, in fact. Jan Nowak was his wartime pseudonym. Jan Nowak was a courier of the Polish Home Army during the war. He was one of the founders, of creators of Radio Błyskawica during the Warsaw Uprising. And after the war, he worked for the Polish section of the BBC. So he had both political experience and some journalist and even radio experience. The interesting point is that Jan Nowak, after the war, was an activist of the Polish freedom movement, independence and democracy, one of the political parties of the Polish emigres. And actually, he was recommended by the political council, Rada Polityczna, the most important organization, alliance of emigre political parties. When Radio Free Europe was created, it was supposed to be a new type of radio in comparison with, for example, Voice of America. The American policymakers and, of course, Free Europe Committee wanted to give the emigres from Eastern Europe the possibility to speak to their countries. It was an important part of this early Cold War US policy, both from the perspective of a psychological warfare, which was treated as one of the most important tools to influence the situation east of the Iron Curtain, and also it was a part of a policy of creating emigre groups who would be allies of US policymakers, and one day they would come back to their countries and influence the situation in these countries. So this American concept of creating radio stations which would be run by the emigres was very much appreciated by at least Polish emigres, and they had incredibly strong and far-reaching expectations how important Radio Free Europe would be for them to carry on their political plans. I would just quote only a very short excerpt from a letter of Stefan Korboński, one of the leaders of the political council, written in April 1950, when just before inauguration of Polish service of Radio Free Europe. Korboński wrote, I quote, "American radio is capable of creating even a completely unknown person in Poland, and it may be the decisive tool in gaining influence in Poland. If we take the recent war as an example, Sikorski, Mikołajczyk and others, together with their politics, would have been completely unknown in Poland had it not been for the BBC programs." We should keep in mind that at the end of the 40s and in early 50s, the widespread expectations were that the new war would break out and that finally the Polish emigres would come back to their countries. So Radio Free Europe for them was perhaps the most important tool in preparing their positions once they return to their countries liberated by the Western forces. Also Americans, both State Department, CIA, and Free Europe Committee were interested in having well-organized and prominent partners on the side of the emigres in running Radio Free Europe and in shaping its programs. In the Polish case, the Americans were going to create a consultative body. There was even a very precise scheme. It was supposed to be composed of 3 representatives of political council and 3 representatives of the committee created by Stanisław Mikołajczyk, former Polish prime minister, and also 1 representative of the exile government. This plan didn't work out because Polish emigres were not ready to cooperate within one body. The representatives of the political council refused to work with the representatives of Stanisław Mikołajczyk. Finally, in October '52, an advisory committee was created, composed by emigre politicians, but invited by the American side. This consultative committee was supposed to have the full access to the guidance papers prepared by Free Europe Committee and also to the records to the transcripts of all programming. And it was supposed to give their opinions every 2 weeks to the American management of Radio Free Europe. This plan completely failed. Very shortly, after even a few months, Polish emigres complained that they didn't have any real influence upon programming. There were even some overly scandals between American management and Polish emigres. For example, Stanisław Korboński was supposed to give a speech for the inauguration of a Polish service of Radio Free Europe in 1950, and the speech was censored by the American management of the radio because Korboński was going to criticize the Yalta conference, Yalta agreements, and what the American policy did to the Polish case. And already in 1952, the disappointment on the side of the Polish emigres was widespread, and especially after the Munich service was inaugurated, which was using the name Voice of Free Poland. The Polish service was widely criticized that it is pretending to be a Polish service run by the Polish emigres, and in fact, this is run by the American agencies. And many Polish emigre newspapers overtly criticized Radio Free Europe for pretending to be Polish, for using the name Voice of Free Poland, and in reality to be the American radio. So to put it in a nutshell, I would say that this American plan to have partners on the side of Polish emigre organizations failed. Jan Nowak-Jeziorański tried to create his team of editors, of broadcasters. It could be interesting, using at first political criteria. Polish political emigre parties recommended members of the staff which were employed by Jan Nowak, who tried to keep some political balance. I think that it's an interesting point for the radio, which became such an important factor in promoting free information across the Iron Curtain. The beginnings were, I would say, organized along the lines which do not have much in common with at least our contemporary understanding of professional journalism. And this is really a very interesting story that over the time, this team in Munich became such a professional team of broadcasters being able to influence the situation behind the Iron Curtain. So if the Polish emigres did not have any real influence upon programming, as they claimed, who really exerted the influence upon programs? This is a very difficult task to give a precise answer to this fundamental question. I would say that the result in terms of programming, of the content of the programs was overlapping of the influence of several factors. Ross Johnson, in his book, described the role of the CIA. We know lots, or we know a little bit, perhaps, about the influence of the State Department. My intuition is that it was rather State Department who was more consistent in its attempts to influence the content of the Radio Free Europe broadcast. Paradoxically enough, I would say that CIA left much more freedom to the broadcasters than State Department. For example, after 1956, in case of the Polish service, tried to silence down open criticism of Gomułka. Gomułka, who was regarded by the State Department as another Tito, as a nationally oriented communist, and according to the State Department, open criticism of Gomułka would be harmful to the US interests. Of course, another important player was Free Europe Committee and its radio department in New York, who wrote policy guidance papers. I read many of them, and my impression is that in the 50s they were rather general. From the 60s I found at the Hoover archives much more detailed policy guidance documents, which even suggested the details of almost daily programming. The third factor were US directors and, for example, a policy advisor in Munich. In the 50s, it was William Griffiths, who was a very strong personality and had a very strong position. And the fourth factor was the Polish staff, the Polish broadcasters. My opinion is that over time, the role of this fourth factor of the Polish staff, headed for more than 20 years by Jan Nowak, was increasing. I wouldn't quite accept Jan Nowak's statement that he didn't care about policy guidance papers. I think that it's a slight exaggeration, but I would say that Jan Nowak was a very flexible, not only broadcaster, he was a very flexible politician, in a very efficient way, maneuvering between Polish emigrant organizations, the leaders of the Polish community in the US, and US management of Radio Free Europe, both in Munich and in New York. My intuition is also that in case of daily broadcasting, which lasted in the 60s around 20 hours daily, it would have been impossible from New York or even from Munich, US management in Munich, to oversee each program. The Americans did not introduce preemptive censorship. Such a preemptive censorship applied only to one most sensitive topic, Polish-German border, other nice line. But in terms of all other topics, the Americans analyzed the programs which were broadcast, and of course there were many discussions, there were conflicts, but my guess, after what I read in the US archives, in the Polish archives, in the archives of the Polish service of Radio Free Europe, is that the position of Jan Nowak was increasingly growing. He became a sort of an expert even to American directors who came to Munich sometimes without a real knowledge, without a real experience in Eastern European affairs, and Jan Nowak was there for more than 20 years, and he, over years, became a partner to US directors of Radio Free Europe in Munich. Especially, I would say that his flexible and moderate position during the political fall after Stalin's death, and especially during the political crisis in 1956, consolidated his position. A striking contrast was a line of the Hungarian service of Radio Free Europe, which was so much criticized after the suppression of the Hungarian Revolution. An example of the very strong and autonomous position by Jan Nowak, there could be many examples of his position, but I would just mention one. example, in the 60s, Jan Nowak became convinced that the main enemy within the Polish Communist Party and within the Polish government was a group led by Minister of Interior Mieczysław Moczar, so-called partisans group, a nationalist group which tried to gain decisive influence within the Polish Communist Party, and Moczar himself was probably thinking about replacing Gomułka. And Jan Nowak had to overcome the reservations of both Radio Free Europe management and State Department, who were not convinced that even such a group as partisans existed. They thought that it was a creation of Jan Nowak's political imagination, and then they were not convinced that Polish service of Radio Free Europe should focus its programs upon partisans group. And when we analyze the programs from the 60s, one can see the growing importance of this theme. Radio Free Europe, Polish service of Radio Free Europe keeps attacking Moczar and warning Polish audience that Moczar is the most important danger threat to what left to Polish political freedoms which Poles gained during the crisis in 1956. If I may address one final point, I would just very briefly mention balloon operations, which were only partly related to Radio Free Europe, but this was the operation carried on by Free Europe Committee, and it was very important. It was regarded by US policymakers as a very important tool in terms of psychological warfare. Thousands of balloons carrying millions of leaflets were flown from Western Germany first to Czechoslovakia and Hungary, and then the plan was to send them also to Poland. These leaflets sent to Czechoslovakia and Hungary encouraged Czechs, Slovaks, and Hungarians to start to carry on various forms of oppositional activities, including even sabotaging compulsory delivery of foods, and even some of them encouraging them to organize street demonstrations. Jan Nowak-Jeziorański and the great majority of Polish emigre politicians were very concerned about this policy. They warned Free Europe Committee and also State Department that if this aggressive policy is implemented in case of Poland, it would create incredible risks that Poles could behave in a more radical way than Czechs, Slovaks, and Hungarians, and the Polish emigre leaders and Jan Nowak tried to remind their American partners that the Poles paid such a great price for their resistance during the war. And this story confirms the position gained by Jan Nowak-Jeziorański and by some Polish emigre leaders. They managed to convince Free Europe Committee and the State Department and the CIA that in case of Poland, a much moderate strategy should be implemented. The balloons which were flown to Poland did not carry the leaflets encouraging to any kind of actions. They carried just, for example, brochures with Józef Światło revelations. Józef Światło was a defector from the Polish Communist Service. They also brought, for example, a book by George Orwell, Animal Farm. So a little bit less radical stuff than those leaflets sent to Hungary and Czechoslovakia. So I would just emphasize that the Polish service of Radio Free Europe over years got increasingly autonomous position vis-a-vis American management in Munich and New York, and also State Department and CIA, although, of course, there were many conflicts, there were many clashes over the years. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I would take the cue of a question which was addressed for the first panel, meaning what is the importance of the locals in this context? And then I was thinking that this is the perfect opening for this panel together with Rose's question. But I see that more we go deeper into the specifics, the dimensions, the traditions of every department, more they are somehow alike. So, for example, for the Romanian case, you have similarities with regards to the fact that, for example, under CIA, they felt more freedom than afterwards. This is what the editors, for example, are saying. You have the same disunity in the exile. You have the same, as Anna says, somehow not just disunity, but an attempt to distance yourself from the exile, which are always considered as doing dirty politics with regards to the clean kind of journalism and even clean kind of approach to culture that is happening within the departments. But at the same time, you always rely on these penumbra organizations, not just for networking, but for very practical purposes. The Romanian department within RFE had one huge problem, meaning that it had the hugest audience, but the scarcest access to sources and information. And why? And this is also a matter of game of misperception, I think, and this history still has to be addressed. Because, for example, there was this two-source rule when, after the CIA disclosures, Radio Free Europe is more guided towards a more professional approach. Then you have this two-source rule, meaning that the editors always have to check an information from two sources, and this is basically the Western newspapers. But how to get this information if the Western newspapers don't address anything about Romania, because Romania is considered through the same kind of Cold War perception of movements and social movements, that there is no social movement because there are no collective movements. You have only disparate rebellions, let's say, against the regime. You have no samizdat, or at least samizdat in the official understanding of the samizdat. There is no publication abroad like in the case of Solzhenitsyn. So the Romanian department was in a very difficult position, and it's not just hard to get information at that time, but even now, because there was not this effort at documenting. So even now it's hard to write even the history of the Romanian department, especially the history of the early 50s, for example. You always have oblique information from what I got at Hoover, from addresses to the National Committee for the Free Europe. Not too much broadcasts. You see names on papers that you cannot find even in the Encyclopedia of the Romanian Exile, for example, Nicolae Neagoe. You don't know Vintilo Brătian, you know that he has links with the liberals, and he was an engineer, but you don't know exactly what these guys were doing. So I think the problem is much more complicated than that of the specific. It's somehow the specifics are also ontologizing a kind of lack of information for acknowledging this kind of specifics. As I said, the Romanian department had to actually be involved in keeping contact with very informal, sometimes intelligence kind of contact with Romania. And this was very hard to do for the 50s, but it became a kind of easier for the 60s, when people were allowed to leave the country and actually talk to the editors. And basically what the editors were doing were to transpire this kind of news to newspapers, and in France, right? Not in Germany, not in Munich, through relationships and cultural contacts rather than political contacts, and then take back the information from these journals and air it as reliable information. So in a way, it was a very closed circuit of getting maybe even very dubious information from within the country, and not just dubious information, but somehow perpetuating the internal fights within the country. So in this sense, the story of the impact of radio is very interesting, because it's not just a matter of somehow opening a kind of discourse towards democratizing, liberalizing, but it's also taking a discourse which comes from the country to the country's own perception with regards to the call. What does liberation for these people? What does liberalization mean? What does equality mean for these people? So in my research, concern with the cultural broadcasts, because not just because these are the most documented, but because they really had the most impact, much bigger impact than the political broadcasts, starting with the 60s until the end of the 80s. So from my research on this cultural broadcast, I can see clearly that what Monica Lovinescu, the main actor in this sense, she was an editor from Paris, so this is another interesting issue, that the center of Romanian broadcasting, the Americans said that they actually accounted for 10% of the things which were said on Radio Free Europe came from Paris, so a very unusual situation. Actually, so Monica Lovinescu was actually perpetuating a war which was unfolding inside the country, and in this sense, even if her mission was the most democratic, westernizing, synchronizing with the West, because her father was the literary critic Eugen Lovinescu, who was also a promoter of synchronization with the West, in both its nuances, kind of self-colonization, but also modernizing. So even she was the most open mind at that time. She conducted a very interesting mission in a discourse in which conservatism and liberalism, patriotism and nationalism overlap, and becomes a very interesting topic for historians, because politics are understood through the prism of culture. And this had consequences at that time, but also consequences nowadays, because you have no economic, social, big systematic insights into what is happening into the country, but you have a kind of moralistic catechism addressed in cultural terms, which always addresses the decalage between the East and the West, the kind of spiritual decalage in her terms. And what was advocated in Munich in compensation was a kind of material decalage. So in between a sort of understanding of a moral deterioration within the country and material deterioration constantly, which was indeed more and more visible in the 80s, you don't have real analysis about what is really happening and why. So first of all, I said it's the background of these people. The most notorious editors come from the literary and cultural field, but why? It's a sort of heritage, let's say, of intelocentrism in Romania. And I would say that the issue is not even that of political parties which are struggling for their representation within the Romanian National Committee and then having a link with the Committee of Free Europe. I would say it's a matter of intellectualism versus gregarious collectivism. And it was always a contempt for these muddled, collectivistic, ruralistic masses onto which you have to broadcast, but also somehow to upsurge. So in this sense, it's not a paradox, the fact that, for example, you have Grigore Gafencu, a politician who was with the National Party, and he was first in, so he was one of the founders of the Romanian National Council. You have him together with Mihail Farcășanu, who was a leader of the liberal youth before the war and during the war, and then you have even Virgil Iarunca, who is meeting these guys. Virgil Iarunca is the husband of Monica Lovinescu, meeting these guys in Paris, and instead of talking politics, they are actually talking against politics, and they are actually talking against even their comrades in the Romanian National Council who are actually criticized and chastised just for doing politics. And for example, Virgil Iarunca is seeing Gafencu. There are some interesting pages, memoir pages of Iarunca, in which he says that he sees the solitude in politics embodied when he sees Gafencu. So you have a sense of isolation, of intellectual isolation of the Romanian exile at New York as well as in Paris. And it was stronger because of the link with Paris. Why? Because in Paris, you know very well, the French intelligentsia had very much leftist propensities. So you can imagine the fate of Romanian exile who had his somehow center in Paris also because Mircea Eliade was there. So for them it was not necessarily the king, but this kind of cultural promoters of Romanian culture. So in a Paris in which you don't have too many intellectual exile traditions, as for example for Hungary or Poland, that's why you cannot have real literary magazines and cultural magazines like the other exile, because there was not a tradition. Although you have a very strong Francophone tradition, that's another thing, but you don't have a tradition of real cooperation in this sense. You have to work and voice freedom and liberalization within a Paris who is not even acknowledging Gulag. And then you have to voice somehow freedom and of looking as anti-fascists for those who are blaming you as being fascists even within the exile community, and not for not the right reason, I would say, because here is another paradox. It was not just that Monica Lovinescu had to rely on phantom organizations and this very informal and almost intelligence kind of getting the news, but their friends really had rightist affinities because they came from Romanian interwar. They were not, don't get me wrong, they didn't come from Iron Guard, but it's very reductive to say about Mircea Eliade, for example, that he had Iron Guard allegiances, and so what with that? We would have to look more for a kind of metaphysical, I would say, metaphysical transcendental nationalism that the interwar was promoting, and this intelligentsia, even without saying that they were Iron Guard adherents, they were not, but they all had this patriotic ethos draped in cultural terms, which could find a dialogue, with a very easy dialogue with the other fascists who were hiding, for example, in Spain, but who were corresponding with them. So the Sorry, yeah.
And then we could come back to the Hungarian-Romanian.
No?
As soon as you could.
Yes. So how many minutes do I have? Just 2 minutes? Okay. Yes. So these are very interesting issue and paradoxical. And last but not least, it's the perception of the Romanians within this whole thing. And the proof of how they were making sense of this cultural Cold War and how they were making sense of politics are, for the moment, the letters addressed to Radio Free Europe. And in those letters, you see exactly what I've been saying, that actually the message did not lead to a kind of social awareness about what the Romanians can do, as the Americans were always voicing in the guidelines, but it's more like a culture of petitioning. They were petitioning to Ceausescu through Radio Free Europe, petitioning for very small things. And human rights issue was not understood in its universalizing and political stance, but within humanitarian discourse, meaning reintegration of families, basically. And then Monica Lovinescu was really held like the Pope, the Romanian Pope in exile, and her posterity in Romania is very interesting because now she is just museified without being understood. And I think this is very symptomatic for nowadays Romanian intelligentsia, who is also feeling disoriented because of a loss even of this cultural cause. Thank you.
Shall I switch it on, or is it okay? Yeah. Okay. Let me confirm, Ioana, with this very short anecdote in the beginning of my talk, how to avoid this problem that an information required confirmation from two independent sources. I was told by one of the Hungarian editors, László Kassa, these stories regularly, that they sent out when they received a message from Hungary, for example, about the Hungarian dissident groups, which could not be confirmed by any other independent source. They sent out to friends in international news agencies this information, which agencies published this information, so they had two independent sources in that way. I don't know, Rost maybe can tell whether the American supervisors knew about these practices, or they just turned their head away. But so actually, I would like to start.
It was a favored trick, in quotation marks, of Jan Novak as well.
So let me start with a short comment on this unfinished debate of the first panel between Scott Lucas and Michael Warner about the inconsistency of the US Cold War policy and strategy. Because I think it really gives us an explanation how, for example, the character of the RFE Hungarian desk program policy was shaped and changed, especially after the '56 revolution. I think there was inconsistency, and there was a kind of moral price behind that, but in my view, it was inevitable. Basically for two reasons. The first reason is that the United States had a kind of moral obligation after the Second World War to continue to represent these democratic values for which they fought this bloody war against Nazi Germany. That, you know, democratic values, national self-determination, independence of nations, and so on and so on. So they just couldn't left unnoticed the fact that the Soviet Empire imposed their power over the Eastern Bloc. They couldn't say that we don't care. So this was a kind of very strong obligation for the international community in order to reinforce the also threatened and in Western Europe, which was also in a very critical situation after the war, both in economic and political sense, and also that was a necessary message for the domestic public as well, that we have a meaning, our fight had a meaning. So this inconsistency is not due to a kind of moral irresponsibility or carelessness. We don't care what happens to the people in the Soviet bloc, and so on and so on. The other factor was the image of the Soviet threat, which came out very early, as George Cannon published his famous article in the Foreign Affairs, that the Soviet threat is not a kind of traditional geopolitical threat. It's not just a threat on some material geopolitical interest of the United States, but it's an ideological one. The nature of the Soviet ideology is always an expansive one, and it poses a direct threat not only to American interests all over the world, but also the American way of life. They also assumed, and not without foundations, that as George Cannon wrote in this article, that appeasement and concession would not solve the problem, because of course the Soviet Union is weak now to expand its power over Western Europe, but its temporary retreat means only that they want to gain strength and start attempts again to their expansion further Western Europe. And losing Western Europe is a catastrophe to the American interests and the direct threat to the American way of life. And if we take into account the third factor, that at the same time they were aware of the fact from the very beginning that containing or rolling back the Soviet power in Eastern Europe must not lead to an outbreak of an open military conflict. They cannot put real military forces, not just because of their military weakness, as Michael told us in Europe, not just for the weakness of their military and political positions in Western and Central Europe, but because of the fact that the outbreak of the Third World War it was out of question from the very beginning. So if you put together these three factors, for me it is obvious that this is a function without solution. It has contradictory expectations, ambitions, but on the other hand, it somehow created a very flexible pattern for American Cold War policy, which enabled them from time to time to adjust their tactics to a new situation, like the situation after the crackdown of the Hungarian Revolution in 1956, which created a new status quo. In a certain sense, it became final that the Soviets will remain in Central Europe for quite a while. So the Soviet rule and the communist rule over these countries is not just a temporary one. So, but this flexibility had its moral cost and also its human toll as well. Let me just mention the fact, as Paweł raised these balloon actions, while there was this, he mentioned this Operation Prospero, which targeted Hungary in 1955. These balloons dropped leaflets about the Hungarian national resistance movement with the demands in 12 points to topple the communist rule in Hungary. At the same time, the National Security Council received the national security estimates regularly, which said that in none of the Soviet bloc countries, neither in Hungary, there is a possibility of a successful outbreak of revolution or uprising, which would have a chance to shake the communist regime, because the grasp of the communist power over these societies is so tight that it's completely hopeless. So there is a clear contradiction. On the one hand, they announce resistance movements like they did it in Poland in 1949 with this Wolność i Niepodległość operation, which was a complete failure. a trap by the Polish security services. They failed in Albania in 1949 in several actions, but still, what I want to say that they could not abandon totally this kind of, so to say, intervention into the affairs of the Soviet bloc countries, and also their policy was a kind of mirror of the supposed and actual subversive propaganda policies of the Soviet Union at the same time. So this RFE project and this all of what we are talking about, in my view, was for counterbalancing in this way and by these methods as well the Soviet practices in Western Europe. They tried to cause, as John Lukács put it in one of his books, digestion problems for the Soviets in Central and Eastern Europe. They tried to prevent the Soviet power to consolidate its power over these countries and societies by every means. And as I said, it had real costs. Why I'm saying this? Because I think how the Hungarian desk operated before '56 and how these policies and programs changed after '56 had a direct relation to this problem. And let me just shortly answer Ross's questions, if I may try. Yes, the Hungarian language broadcast started from the New York office, I think also in August 1950. There was a bureau in the Empire State Building where the Hungarian desk operated, but it was rather just an experimental program. They created a 1-hour program every day, and there were very big difficulties for putting these programs. They had to send this 1-hour program to Athens by plane, where there was a ship which sailed out to the Mediterranean Sea and tried to broadcast this 1 hour towards Hungary. And you can imagine how limited the influence of such a radio program was in 1950. Of course, the situation changed when the RFE premises were open in Munich, and also the focus of the editorial office changed. The New York office was reorganized in 1952, and many of the colleagues moved to Munich to contribute to the Munich program, and the decisions over the program, over the program policy was made mostly in Munich. The New York office stayed in function until the very end, but as a supplementary department of the, as far as I can understood their relationship, they had to send a 1.5 hour program every day, mostly analysis and commentaries on world politics, information on developments in Protestant churches, and information on the Hungarian emigration in the United States. But as they complained many times, they did not really get a real feedback from their colleagues in Munich. What were the use of these programs? What were how the audience accepted, whether they liked it or not. So sometimes they felt to be very frustrated because of this kind of negligence. But on the other hand, they continued a kind of systematic research and archival work. We know it because the historical archive of the New York office also arrived, most of the records arrived to Budapest, the Western Press archives, the archives on world communist movements outside Europe and such stuff, which was a very valuable contribution to the historical records of the Research Institute of Radio Free Europe. Now let me turn to the... Yeah.
Since it's my duty to think about the time and the lunch,
Yeah.
I'm sorry to rush you, but if you could take maybe 5 minutes so that we still have a little time for discussion before 1 o'clock.
Okay, then let me jump to the programs. Okay. It was obvious from the very beginning that the priority of the Hungarian desk and the most popular programs were the news and the political analysis. But there were they tried to define different social groups and clusters of society as target groups. Like in the early 50s, in the countryside, the main problem was the collectivization and the campaign against the kulaks. So that was one of the most important political issue. The poor living standards of Hungarians, the exploitation, the brutal political terror over the society as well. There were programs targeting the intellectuals, but mostly they focused on the political analysis and the political criticism of communist propaganda. The language, similarly to the Czechoslovak and Polish case, was quite aggressive and sometimes provocative. There were many programs, not many, but there were some programs which directly targeted the members of the local nomenclatura. The Black Book, the Night Patrol, and other programs which named local party leaders or factory directors or directors of agricultural cooperatives and blamed them for their crimes and misdeeds they committed over the people who they directed. It was a very effective program in a sense, because most of these programs based on information they received from the refugees in refugee camps. Freshly arrived refugees gave interviews to Radio Free Europe people and gave interviews about the local conflicts. And I think on the one hand, these programs were very popular, according to the polls, because it somehow made eloquent the personal aspect of the political oppression, and also it imitated that the radio was somehow inside. It was a domestic radio station, which could keep an eye on everything, like the omnipotent communist state. So it was also a kind of mirror of the image of the communist totalitarian system. And also it somehow sent a message that nobody would escape of being held responsible for their misdeeds. Of course, sometimes the blames and the charges were unfounded, and the rationality of these programs was questioned many times during the 50s. And it is in a certain way, it became counterproductive, because somehow these programs reinforced the feeling among the audience that the communist rule was just a short-lived and temporary one, and the perpetrators would be called on account very soon, which was a false expectation, as it turned out after the '56 revolution. Of course, the programs in this respect changed fundamentally after the '56 revolution. These programs were eliminated. These personal intimidation programs were eliminated. The volume of these political criticisms were tuned down as well, and some new genres came into picture, like popular music programs and boulevard magazines, so less political programs, partly because of the fact that according to the audience polls of Radio Free Europe in the early 60s, just after 5-6 years, the 1956 revolution, the Hungarian population was less receptive to political messages. They also had to realize that the Hungarian society really appreciates some of the results of socialist developments. They ranked among the priorities the social welfare system, the medical system, the land reform, the nationalization of big industry, and so on and so on. So it seemed that the Hungarian society thought it seriously in 1956 that they did not want a capitalist system but a reformed democratic socialist system, which also made RFE editors a little bit cautious about sending direct political anti-regime messages, because they believed it would not find really their audience. So let me stop here and then.
Many themes, as we've heard. Let me just stress a couple of them. The generational conflict was known within probably all of the RFE services. It was particularly a conflict in the Czechoslovak service between the 48ers and later the 68ers. The importance of Jan Novak, the importance of individuals in the history of Radio Free Europe and every place else. And so the particular role of Jan Novak and the Polish service. In some respects, the Polish service and the Romanian service were the most effective, one could say, at least in certain respects. Dick Rosen, who's with us, and I helped get published last year a kind of memoir and study by Jim Brown, a longtime RFE director. And it contains a memorandum that Jim wrote in 1977, contrasting the Polish and the Romanian audiences and the important role in his view, but the quite different role that the RFE played in those two countries. And Ioana has properly, to my view, properly stressed the importance of the Romanian cultural programming, and a subject on which he's done a lot of work, the letters to the letters to RFE, which were an important part of the program, read by the director, Noel Bernard, and the change over time, and particularly after 1956 in the Hungarian program. And you alluded, András, to the teenager party, the introduction of music by Geza Ekic, popular American music. And the goal was, and I think to some extent it was successful, to interest people in music, and then perhaps they'd stick around and tune into some of the political programs as well, and I think some of that happened. So many themes. We didn't have any attention to the Bulgarian service, and then after the Free Europe period, only in the 80s, the three Baltic services, which had started in the 70s, came to Radio Free Europe. So that's the evolution. We have 10 or at the most 15 minutes for discussion and questions. I think we can certainly entertain questions in Polish as well as English. So please, the floor is open.
Okay, I will try in English. Władysław Buchak, Institute of National Remembrance. Okay, I have a question to the all panelists. Do you think that some problems, misperceptions or errors, originated in fact a little bit earlier? I mean, in the psychological warfare during the Second World War. In the operation against Nazi Germany, like those described in the famous book by Sefton Delmer, Black Boomerang. At least, as far as I know, at least Jan Novak was involved personally in such an operation. I don't know about the other country sections, but you know, the question is whether this is the problem. The stations like Atlantic Zender, they were straight diversion. Maybe this is the source of this misperception problems. This is the question, my question.
Yes, but perhaps, as I said in the beginning, in my view, the American Cold War strategy consisted this incoherency from the very beginning. When we read these National Security Council decisions from 1948 up to the 50s, these kind of contradictions are still there, no matter whether it somehow outlines a more aggressive policy against the Soviet Union or a less one. But still, these options that we must counterbalance the Soviet threat by white and black propaganda at the same time, by supporting subversive covert actions and even military actions. I think Scott, in Scott's book, you wrote about this volunteer freedom. Of course, they started to organize these volunteer groups in Western Europe from émigré Eastern European, these paramilitary things after Stalin's death, because they saw a chance that the Soviet Union would collapse after the death of the dictator. But on the other hand, behind that, there was always this serious consideration that these actions, the US government must not be held liable or responsible for any of these actions. This is not part of the official policy of the United States, and these actions must not lead to the outbreak of a general war. So,
thank you. Yeah. So, Kati? Oh, okay. First, please, Mr. Gretzky, and then Kati. Oh, Glenn.
Anyway, yeah, Len Baldigay, formerly USA and formerly served in Poland. Thaddeus Mink, was there any fundamental change in the Romanian services policies following the Nixon visit to Bucharest in 1969?
You mean policies regarding the Romanian department from?
Yeah.
I don't know specifically. You know, I always knew the editor's perception of the guidelines. So it was a paradox because Ceausescu was somehow preferred by the Americans. He was seen like a maverick. He was seldom compared in the guidelines with Tito, and you remember that there were many guidelines which were actually telling to the Poles or the Czech and Slovaks, the Romanians, to support Tito despite the fact that he's a communist. So this applied to Ceausescu as well. Ceausescu had to be respected and always talked about with Mr. Ceausescu. Which was unaccepted or very accepted with difficulty by the Romanian editors. And this year is very interesting because it's exactly the year when the broadcast Romanian actuality is actually enforcing their very blatant tone. So it's the second romanticism, which is inside the Romanian Radio Free Europe desk, which is coinciding exactly with this American cooperation with Ceausescu. And you can say that the end of the 70s and beginning of the 80s are somehow echoing the 50s, when the exile also felt very frustrated that actually not the liberation doesn't mean total liberation, and then they don't know what is their role there. It was a real problem with Ceausescu. And Nicolae Constantin Munteanu, who is actually helping Noel Bernard and then becomes the most prominent Romanian editor of the Romanian actuality, who is actually about, specifically about Ceausescu. He starts being very ironical about Ceausescu. And I think the Romanian actuality program is only Ceausescu focused. So it's not it's not an analysis of the economic situation. Everything is seen as an emanation of Ceausescu, in a sort also of a polemics with, I think, the guidelines that you are saying. So it had an ironic consequence also when you think of what happened to Ceausescu, because he was blamed for everything with regards to Romanian communism.
Good, thank you. Paweł, did you want to add, please?
I would like to address the question raised by Dr. Buchak about the wartime experience. I'm not quite sure what you meant by misperceptions, because in case of Polish emigre leaders and Jan Nowak himself, the wartime experience meant mostly a great success of BBC and a great impact of BBC upon occupied Poland and also upon other Nazi-occupied countries. And the goal was to somehow repeat the success of the wartime BBC. It was a point of reference in the early time of Radio Free Europe. And to give the most general answer, I would say that at least the Polish service somehow achieved the same level of importance and influence as BBC during the war. I would also like to emphasize one other point in terms of the psychological warfare by the US agencies. The balloon operations, in my opinion, are an example of not a very successful psychological warfare. But on the other hand, many programs by Radio Free Europe were very effective. In my opinion, the broadcasting of Józef Światło revelations probably was an example of the most successful US psychological warfare against the Soviet bloc, at least in the early Cold War. These revelations broadcast by Radio Free Europe started the fall, started the de-Stalinization in Poland.
Thank you. Kati, did you have a question? Kati? Yeah. And then I suppose we'll have to conclude, but we'll continue the discussion at lunch.
This question is for András, but I'd actually like input from the rest of the panel as well. And that is, I heard you referred to the audience polls, and these listener surveys are often cited in scholarship regarding Radio Free Europe programming, et cetera. What I'd like to know is, particularly during the hard days of the Cold War, the statistical reliability of these polls has to be suspect. I mean, how in the world did they gather or create any kind of statistical models that were at all correct? Or did they simply serve or reinforce the policy decisions that had already been made?
Could I offer the first response? Because it applies not to the individual services so much, but to the Radio Free Europe organization, and Radio Liberty did something comparable. Before 1960, there's almost no sort of plausible survey research. What comes after 1966 we could call surrogate survey research. And I'd emphasize this was not polling with emigres or refugees. This was polling of travelers once the became possible from Eastern Europe. Between 1960 and 1990, 100,000 interviews were conducted with East Europeans, 100,000. It was hardly a representative sample. Efforts were made to weigh and correct. And the experts and the scholars can go back and judge today how successful that was. And you can compare the results, as some have done, with retrospective surveys that were done after 1989. What did you listen to, when, and how? And you can compare it with some of the internal secret surveys that were done by under the regime auspices in some of the countries. That's the overview. If you have something on the specific countries and the specific country audiences, please.
Yeah, let me answer a very strange coincidence to this question. Of course, in the 50s, almost nobody could travel to the West. So the information came mostly from these refugee interviews. Then in the 60s, as Ross said, there were more and more tourists outside. There were polls which somehow tried to compare the feedback from the visitors, as they called, and from the refugees who stay. And there were significant differences in the responses they received from those who wanted to return to Hungary after their travel, and from those who wanted to stay, who left socialist Hungary. But I think not the reliability is the key issue in the 60s, but let me tell you a very interesting case. The audience research staff prepared a report sometimes in 1962 in which they called the attention to this very interesting fact that there was an official public opinion poll in the western part of Hungary, conducted by this, under the control of the communist regime, conducted by sociologists, Hungarian sociologists, and they were happy to announce in this report in 1956 that the results of this Hungarian public opinion poll about the political preferences of the Hungarians were absolutely in line with the results of those audience polls or public opinion polls on political attitudes of the Hungarian made by the RFE audience research staff. And then they enlisted these priorities, like I said, you know, social welfare, nationalization, land reform, state intervention into the economic life, security, free medical treatment services, and so on and so on. So all of these socialist achievements, the achievements of the socialist society, which made it morally and economically superior to capitalism. So on the one hand, they were happy to find the fact that their own polls were reliable because the official Hungarian polls showed the same results. On the other hand, they abandoned the fact that these, the real results did not show too much interest among the Hungarian population to capitalist free market economy and such stuff.
Thank you. And Paweł has the last word, I think. Oh, did you? And then we have to go to lunch after that.
In case of Poland, the communist authorities made a professional team of sociologists to conduct regular opinion polls. They were carried out by Ośrodek Badania Opinii Publicznej, a center for the public research, and they were initiated in the late 60s and carried out every year until the end of the 80s. They were confidential polls, but prepared by professional sociologists, in my opinion, according to professional rules. Their results were available only to the party and government officials. And according to these polls, the audience of Radio Free Europe and other Western broadcasters decreased during the time of relative political and economic stabilization. So the lowest number was, as far as I remember, 8% of the Poles who listened to Radio Free Europe in 72. So the time of relative peace and stabilization. But as soon as political crisis or economic crisis increased, also the audience increased. And in 1980-81, according to these official but confidential opinion polls, around 50% of the Poles listen to Radio Free Europe. So I think that this is an excellent result, but internal polls by Radio Free Europe always gave higher results. And I'm inclined as a researcher to stick to these confidential but official opinion polls in Poland.
Okay, thank you. I interviewed one pollster in Washington, a person who was actually conducting these interviews. Besides confirming this, he said that actually they had to give the answers to the questions after that, so they had to remember what these people were saying. And these interviews were done in very difficult conditions. How you choose the location, the restaurant, not to be too visible, then another person from Radio Free Europe checking up on you. It was not done on the one hand professionally because of this unrepresentative sample, and second because in the field it was really hard to do and then transcribe. But this is not the most important question. The important question is how they were framing also the questions. So for a researcher, this is interesting, right? So for example, what András was saying about welfare, it's always interesting to see this question addressed to what the state is doing for the people and the privation of the people instead of just viewing politics as a kind of bottom-up grouping. So in this sense, the West and the East are not just confirming each other, but having kind of the same political language. And that's why maybe they are getting the same results. And the method that they were using was called continuous representative sample, something like that. So the unique confirmation principle was to obtain the same results for a period of years. So in this sense, they somehow self-indulge their results because they always get the same results. So that was a confirmation of the good result. But what is interesting is that because of this unrepresentativeness of the sample, MIT developed some very interesting methods of inferring reliability from unrepresentativity. And this was called the mostellarization method. And this mostellarization method, very complicated mathematical method, is used now by public opinion polls. So Radio Free Europe has a kind of an input to how nowadays public opinion is asserted, yes.
Thank you. For further research, there's efforts, several chapters that attempt to deal with this issue in the CEU published volume, Cold War Broadcasting, that I co-edited. A display copy is available outside. There is also, for further research, there's a very long interview, many, many hours, that Jean Parda, who headed audience research at the end at Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, conducted with the gentleman in Vienna who headed the institute that conducted the largest number of these interviews. And it's a multi-hour oral history account of his operation, which has not really been used in research yet. With that, please join me in thanking our panel. And Anna, tell us what we should do next.